He was sent to witness the end of the war, but what he found was not closure. It was silence. I am Gerard Williams, a war correspondent who walked through the ruins of Berlin in 1945. They told us Hitler was dead, sealed in a bunker and burned into ash. But in all the rubble, in all the smoke and chaos, there was one thing missing: proof. And that silence. It still echoes. Because buried inside it is a truth that could change everything we think we know. Before I take you deeper into this hidden chapter of history, I need your help. This channel is on the verge of reaching a major milestone, and every subscription is a way of preserving investigations like this, stories that governments preferred to bury. By subscribing now, you don't just support the channel, you gain access to inquiries and revelations that almost never reach the public. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from, city and country. Because this story belongs to all of us, no matter where we are. Berlin, April 1945. The Reich's capital was no longer a city, but a carcass. Buildings stood shattered, their facades crumbling under Soviet artillery. Streets were strewn with corpses and abandoned vehicles, the stench of smoke and burnt flesh heavy in the air. Civilians moved like shadows, terrified, waiting for the Red Army to sweep through. Amid this collapse, I stood with my notepad and camera, one of the first foreign correspondents to witness the aftermath. History claimed that beneath this destroyed city, the dictator of Europe had ended his life. But when I entered the smoldering remains of the Reich Chancellery, there was something disturbingly absent. No photographs, no verifiable body, only rumors, whispered with certainty, as if certainty alone could seal the war's ending. They told us Joseph Goebbels lay charred in the garden, his children murdered before him. They told us Eva Braun swallowed poison at Hitler's side. And they told us Adolf Hitler himself had pulled the trigger, his body reduced to ash by loyal aides. The story was airtight, repeated by generals, by governments, by textbooks. Yet as I walked through those ruins, I realized that what we had was not evidence, but narrative. And in war, narratives are weapons just as powerful as bombs. But there was one detail I couldn't shake. Stalin himself did not believe the story. And when the man who commanded the Red Army doubts the death of his greatest enemy, it means the silence hides something much larger. That's where our investigation begins. The official version is simple. On April 30th, 1945, with Soviet troops closing in, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide inside the Führer bunker. His aides, loyal to the end, carried the bodies outside, doused them in fuel, and set them ablaze. By the time the Soviets entered the compound, only fragments remained. It was enough, we were told, to close the book on the most destructive figure of the 20th century. But history leaves traces. And in this case, the traces are disturbingly inconsistent. No independent forensic examination was ever allowed. No photographs of the supposed remains were released. The only physical proof, a skull fragment and dental records, came from Soviet authorities who refused outside verification for decades. Then, in 2009, the unthinkable happened. DNA tests revealed that the skull fragment belonged not to Hitler, but to a woman. The only piece of evidence was a fraud, intentional or not. Still, the Western Allies accepted the Soviet version. Why? Because they needed closure. Germany lay in ruins, millions were displaced. Europe demanded certainty. Declaring Hitler dead allowed the world to draw a line under the war and move forward. But behind closed doors, leaders knew the story was less than airtight. At Potsdam, Stalin told Truman and Churchill that Hitler might have escaped. It was not propaganda meant for the masses. It was a suspicion voiced at the highest level of power. And that is where the silence deepens. Why would Stalin fuel such doubt if the evidence was clear? Unless, of course, clarity never existed to begin with. Decades later, declassified intelligence reports shattered the illusion of certainty. FBI memos from 1947 described sightings of a man matching Hitler's description in Argentina. Short mustache, pronounced limp, heavily guarded by ex-SS officers. Another report detailed a compound near the Chilean border where locals whispered of the German chief, who lived behind tall fences and spoke little. These were not the ramblings of conspiracy theorists. They were investigated, filed, cross-referenced, serious enough to remain on the desks of intelligence officers years after the war. Even J. Edgar Hoover himself acknowledged that without a body, the Bureau could never rule out Hitler's survival. I traveled through South America, retracing the steps outlined in those reports. In remote Patagonian villages, I heard stories passed down for generations. Of a tall German who never showed his face, of estates guarded by armed men, of houses where the curtains never opened. In one case, an old man recounted how his father delivered supplies to a secluded mansion. The orders were strict: leave the goods at the side entrance, never approach the main house. Everyone in town called the resident the boss, a name spoken with fear rather than respect. Skeptics will say these are just myths, folklore twisted by imagination, and perhaps they are. But there is one problem. The same details appeared across different towns, across different decades. The limp, the silence, the guards, too consistent to dismiss, too haunting to ignore. But eyewitness tales alone are not proof. What came next, however, forced the entire narrative to crack. Because in 2009, the world discovered that the one piece of physical evidence, the skull in Moscow, did not belong to Hitler. And that single revelation changes everything. Moscow, 2009. Inside the dim archives of the Russian state collection, a fragment of skull that had been guarded for decades was finally subjected to modern forensic testing. This relic, long presented as Adolf Hitler's remains, had been shown to journalists and researchers as the physical confirmation that the Führer died in Berlin. But when American scientists conducted DNA analysis, the result was clear and impossible to dispute. The skull belonged not to Hitler, but to a woman under the age of 40. In a single moment, the only tangible evidence supporting the official story collapsed. For nearly 60 years, historians and governments leaned on that fragment as a foundation stone. It was cited in textbooks, displayed in documentaries, and offered as closure. Yet, with one test, it dissolved into doubt. I remember the silence in the room when the results were published. It was not the noise of discovery, but the unsettling quiet of realizing that history's most accepted truth had no body to stand on. If the skull was not Hitler's, then what exactly had the Soviets been hiding all this time? And why maintain the illusion for so long? The implications were devastating. The Soviet Union had always controlled the narrative of Hitler's death, refusing international verification in 1945, retracting statements, and altering its version of events multiple times. Stalin himself told Truman that Hitler may have fled, a claim that at the time was dismissed as political maneuvering. But consider this. Would a leader known for ruthless precision throw uncertainty into the world stage without purpose? This was not mere speculation. It was part of a deliberate strategy, a calculated act of disinformation at the dawn of the Cold War. And here lies the breaking point. If the most iconic piece of evidence was false, then every other piece of the story must be re-examined. The dental fragments, allegedly proof of Hitler's identity, were never independently tested. They were authenticated only by assistants under Soviet custody, people whose testimonies were shaped under the shadow of a regime known for coercion. Even today, those fragments remain locked away, shielded from transparent inquiry. Why? That question is as important as the missing body itself. The revelation of 2009 should have reopened the investigation worldwide. In any other case, a murder, a trial, a disappearance, such a contradiction would demand a retrial of facts. But instead, silence followed. Governments did not challenge the official narrative, and most historians continued to write as if nothing had changed. Closure had become more valuable than truth. And yet, truth has a way of resurfacing. Because if the Soviets lied about the skull, what else did they suppress? And if the world accepted it unquestioningly, then how many other stories from the war remain buried under layers of convenient certainty? This is where the story begins to shift from history into something more dangerous. The possibility that the final chapter of the war was written not with evidence, but with propaganda. The answer, however, does not rest in Moscow alone. It lies thousands of miles away, across oceans, in places where whispers became testimonies, and testimonies became patterns. The next trail does not begin in the ruins of Europe, but in the jungles and mountains of South America. And that trail leads us directly into the Nazi escape networks. Buenos Aires, late 1940s. Argentina was not just recovering from the war, it was reshaping itself as a refuge. President Juan Perón's government openly welcomed thousands of German immigrants, many of whom were not ordinary settlers, but former Nazi officers carrying forged Red Cross papers and Vatican-sanctioned documents. Entire communities with German architecture and language emerged across Patagonia. Within these enclaves, secrecy was currency, and silence was protection. The infrastructure for escape, known as the Nazi rat lines, was real, and it worked. Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust, lived in Argentina until Israeli agents captured him in 1960. Josef Mengele, the infamous doctor of Auschwitz, vanished into Brazil and died unpunished. These men were not outliers. They were proof of an operational system that shielded the very worst of the Reich. This system raises the inevitable question: if Eichmann and Mengele escaped, why not Hitler? He had deeper resources, more loyal followers, and greater incentive to vanish. Unlike his subordinates, his death or survival carried world-shaking consequences. The logistics of escape were already tested. Safe houses stretched from Genoa to Buenos Aires. Ships departed European ports under neutral flags, carrying fugitives disguised as technicians, priests, or businessmen. In South America, sympathetic governments provided cover, while communities of expatriates offered shelter. The possibility of Hitler using the same routes was not fantasy. It fit the very pattern the Allies themselves documented. The geopolitical consequences of this possibility are profound. If Hitler truly escaped, then the Soviet Union's monopoly on the narrative was not just sloppy reporting. It was a strategic deception. Stalin's insistence that Hitler was alive may not have been disinformation, but suspicion grounded in Soviet intelligence. At the same time, Washington and London faced their own dilemma. Pursuing every lead risked destabilizing already fragile alliances, particularly as the Cold War loomed. In this environment, ambiguity became useful. Leaving the matter unresolved allowed governments to shift attention toward rebuilding Europe, containing communism, and avoiding the psychological shock of a fugitive Führer. There is another angle often overlooked. Even if Hitler died in Berlin, the persistence of doubt served a political purpose. A missing corpse is more than an inconvenience. It is a weapon. For the Soviets, keeping the West uncertain about Hitler's fate meant keeping them distracted, funneling resources into intelligence work rather than reconstruction. For the Allies, presenting his death as certain gave their populations closure, even if the evidence was thin. Two opposing needs converged into one outcome: a narrative accepted without proof. Now imagine the three scenarios that remain on the table. First, Hitler did die in Berlin, but the Soviets manipulated the evidence, withholding remains to control the post-war narrative. Second, Hitler survived the bunker but died soon after in exile, buried in anonymity somewhere in South America. A shadow over history, but not its future. Third, the most disturbing, Hitler lived for years in hiding, protected by loyal networks and silent governments, shaping post-war fascist movements from the shadows. Each scenario carries different consequences, yet each points to the same unsettling truth. The world never confirmed what happened. This lack of confirmation ripples through history. Intelligence agencies in the 1950s kept Hitler files open, citing ongoing sightings and reports. The CIA, in declassified documents, tracked rumors of compounds in the Andes. British intelligence monitored movements of German fugitives in Spain and Argentina. If these agencies, built to identify threats, continued to investigate Hitler's possible survival, then the matter was never closed behind closed doors, no matter what the public was told. And that is where the danger lies. What governments tell their people is not always what they fear in private. The personal consequences for those who carried this silence were just as heavy. For men like Gerard Williams, decades of archives and testimonies revealed a pattern that the official story never addressed. Locals who claimed to have seen the German boss lived in fear, some refusing to speak even after 60 years. Witnesses who did talk often lowered their voices, as if naming him would still bring punishment. The secrecy itself becomes evidence, an atmosphere too dense to dismiss as coincidence. Here we reach a mini-climax of the investigation. In one case, Williams was handed an old photograph by a local guide in Argentina. The image showed a secluded estate deep in the forest, destroyed years later under mysterious circumstances. Villagers swore that a powerful figure once lived there, a man never addressed by name. For Williams, this was not proof of survival, but it was proof of possibility. And in history, possibility is enough to rewrite entire narratives. But here is where the story bends once more. If Hitler truly lived beyond 1945, even briefly, the impact would not be limited to his survival. It would mean that the final chapter of the war, the closure the world relied upon, was manufactured. And if closure can be manufactured, then so can history itself. The question that lingers is not only whether Hitler escaped, but whether the truth was deliberately buried. And if this is the case, then we are left with an even darker possibility, that the most critical truths of the 20th century were written not in evidence, but in silence. The trail from South America leads us to the final confrontation in this story. Not in the jungles or the Andes, but in the very archives of governments who knew more than they ever revealed. And it is there, in the clash between secrecy and revelation, that this investigation reaches its climax. Washington, 1955. In a locked room deep inside FBI headquarters, a stack of reports marked "unconfirmed" sat on J. Edgar Hoover's desk. They described sightings of a man who fit Hitler's profile, living quietly in Argentina under guard. The director's note was brief but revealing. Until evidence of death is produced, survival cannot be ruled out. These were not conspiracy theories whispered in dark corners. These were official documents circulating through the arteries of American intelligence, hidden from the public eye. And yet, the public narrative remained unchanged. Hitler had died in Berlin. This is where the story reaches its most unsettling climax. For decades, governments entertained the possibility of Hitler's survival behind closed doors while feeding the world a different version. It was not a coordinated lie in the sense of fabrication, but a deliberate silence. The kind that allows one version of history to become institutionalized while burying the uncertainty beneath layers of secrecy. If closure was manufactured, then history itself was staged. The consequences of this silence stretch far beyond Hitler. Consider the Cold War context. Both Washington and Moscow found value in ambiguity. For the Soviets, suggesting Hitler had escaped kept pressure on the West and fueled distrust. For the Americans, confirming his death without evidence gave the public a sense of finality at a time when instability threatened to spiral into chaos. In both cases, the truth was secondary to strategy. The result was a paradox. The most important death of the 20th century was accepted without proof, because proof was inconvenient. And here lies the heart of the matter. This investigation is not only about Hitler's fate, it is about the way nations write endings to wars, even when the evidence does not align. Wars do not end in silence, yet silence was all that remained in Berlin. Stalin's contradictory claims, the Soviets' refusal to release verifiable remains, the DNA test that shattered the only artifact we were given. These are not loose threads. They are signs of a story too fragile to withstand scrutiny. The mini-climax comes when we realize that the mystery may never be solved in full. In 2009, when the skull fragment was revealed to be a fraud, the world should have demanded answers. Instead, the reaction was muted, as if reopening the case was too dangerous, too destabilizing. And that silence, once again, becomes the loudest evidence of all. Because when silence protects a narrative, it often means the truth would change far more than just the history books. For Gerard Williams, the correspondent who began this journey in the ruins of Berlin, the investigation is not about proving that Hitler lived. It is about proving that history never confirmed his death. The distinction matters. If Hitler died in the bunker, then history was sloppy, but not deceptive. But if he did not, even for a brief escape, then the post-war world was built on a false ending. And in geopolitics, false endings are just the beginning of new conflicts. We return now to where we began. In 1945, amid the ruins of Berlin, I stood among the rubble and heard only silence. That silence has followed us for 80 years. They told us the war ended there, that Hitler's death was certain. But evidence never closed the door. And if even 1% remains open, then the story of the 20th century is not finished. The final question is not whether Hitler lived or died. It is whether we allowed ourselves to accept closure without proof. If we did, then this is more than a mystery about one man. It is a warning about how history is written and about how much we are willing to believe when the truth is inconvenient. Because in the end, wars are not decided only by guns or treaties. They are decided by the stories we choose to accept as final. And perhaps, this story was never truly finished.